That is your 1 minute warning. Okay, it's 5:35, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a we have a strings concert tonight at 7, so we're going to stop because several people need to get over there to the strings concert. So my name is Jennifer Ivy Tatum, Superintendent. Thank you for coming tonight, and we have a pretty set schedule, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to introduce Board President Paul Pulowski to say a few words of welcome.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Education, I want to extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you to this important public forum regarding the proposed elementary school attendance boundary maps. Your presence here tonight underscores the deep care and concern that you have for the well-being and education of our children, and we greatly appreciate your engagement in this process. Tonight we gather to engage in a crucial dialogue about the trade-offs inherent in selecting the best possible maps for our elementary school attendance boundaries. We understand that for many families, the prospect of potential changes can evoke feelings of uncertainty and concern. It's important to recognize that each map represents a set of difficult decisions aimed at balancing various factors to ensure the best possible outcomes for all students. We want to assure you that your questions, concerns, and perspectives are not only valued, but actively encouraged in this forum. We are fortunate to have the expertise of our external consultants who have worked diligently to develop these maps, available tonight to provide insight and address any inquiries that you might have. We understand that change can be challenging, especially when it involves our children and their education. Rest assured your voices will be heard and your concerns will be taken seriously. While we may face limitations due to resources and constraints, we are committed to treating each concern with empathy and exploring every possible avenue to support the needs of every child, regardless of the building they may attend next year. Together, let us approach tonight's discussions with open minds, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to ensuring the best possible educational experience for all of our children. Thank you once again for your presence and participation. Let's proceed with the spirit of collaboration and community.
Oh, we appreciate that. I should have said this at the beginning, a little housekeeping. So if your preferred language is Spanish, Lucia, can you raise your hand? You might want to group yourself by that screen because the translations are in Spanish back there. If your preferred language is French, Bonnie Teal, Ms. Teal is here, and you can position yourself by that monitor. Restrooms are out this door and to the left down the hallway. And if you have I see some familiar faces from last night, so we have adjusted our schedule a little bit. So I'm going to introduce Rob in just a few minutes, but at the end of our at the end of our session, we've changed our public input to reflect questions and comments from 6 to 6:30. So we'll ask that people who have questions and comments, we'll invite you to come up to this side because the mic only goes to about right here. And from 6:30 to 7, then we will kind of have administrators walk around. We'll invite people to go out to the large maps and we'll continue to collect your feedback. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our consultant. This is Robert Schwartz from RSP and Associates. They're stationed or their home base is Kansas, but they have worked with many schools in Illinois, mostly in the Chicago area, districts much larger than ours, with really increasing enrollment booms. So we're really excited that we've had the opportunity to have his expertise and have him working with us for the last few months. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert.
Great, and one little housekeeping. Do we have this set up so I can advance slides? Maybe the batteries are dead. I think the batteries are dead. So you might have to be my Vanna. All right, so as we figure out the technology, good evening. This morning, I had the privilege of being able to run on your campus. It was pretty cool. Drove around to some of the places that were talked about last night, so that way I could get a sense of some of the areas with my own eyes. So that was really valuable. Tonight I'm going to do some right setting, but I want to make sure who was here last night. If you could raise your hand so I get a sense of how many repeat persons there is. There's a few. All right, great. So I will not put you to sleep. The things I'm going to talk about are a little bit about the process that's for this district. We'll talk a little bit about some of the data that's built into how we're able to make some of these decisions. And then I'll talk a little bit about the concepts. The majority of this time is going to be split between, as the superintendent indicated, between some comments, questions that maybe we can answer with or without some of the data. And then we'll have you the ability to go to 6 different stations in here, a Spanish station out to the left, and a French station out to the right. So that's what we're going to be doing. A little more about RSP. I know some people have been digging into what is RSP, what do we do? We exclusively work with school districts all through the Midwest. As the superintendent indicated, we do a lot of work in Illinois, and we've been involved in some really interesting projects that have helped advance what's going to happen in the classrooms for students. And so it's pretty cool to put that all together. So you can look more about that with us later. We do have a process, and one thing that I wanted to also update you with is there were 3 slides that we made some changes to help with the communication. This is one of those slides. We wanted to make sure that everyone understood the process, that April 2nd is the first read for the board, and April 16th is when they would vote on whatever the plan may look like. So again, here's the process that was laid out for this district, this situation where we had the board give us some parameters of some things that we needed. There was some stuff that administration provided. And then ultimately, what you're going to hear from me is some of the data lent itself to start with these 2 concepts, with the dual language being at a different facility for each of those concepts. So that's the process. Some of the objectives that we were trying to achieve in this process is, of course, to alleviate some of the challenges that we see with boundaries and enrollments in each of these particular buildings. We have a dual language that the board has indicated would be in 1 facility, not 2 facilities. And then we also have some other situations with what we have with special education and where it is, where does it stay. That kind of came out with our F and Q questions. I want to spend a little time here. Back on December 5th, we tried to get a preference of how we would look at boundaries from the board. And so if you go back and listen to that conversation, there were more than board members who were looking in on this particular process. There were some persons in the audience that voted. But from that particular evening, there was preference for neighborhoods, proximity to schools, more than there was with balance in socioeconomics in the buildings. So again, this isn't a prioritized criteria, as in some of our other processes that you may do some research on. One of the things that's wrapped around the entire process is this ACE concept. So everyone, if you're in a building, you understand what the academics mean to your building, you understand the culture, some of these beliefs and traditions, and some economic realities of what we can do in any of these buildings, whether it's to it physically or to its staffing. So we have these limitations that's wrapped around whatever concept that we create, and we have to be beholden to that. What I'm going to do a little differently tonight, since we're on this boundary criteria, is kind of explain how these criteria worked for your district. Contiguous attendance areas kind of sounds like a disease. It's not COVID. If you think about your current attendance areas, I step up to the map. Right now, we don't have contiguous attendance areas, meaning that everything's compact, where you would see 5 beautifully laid out colors. It's not working that way with contiguous. So if we wanted the boundaries to be contiguous, it would look more like that. Demographic considerations. If you go back to the slide on December 5th, we have preference for neighborhood schools over demographics. But we have realities of things that we can't change in the community. Where houses are built, who moves into those houses, where our buildings exist, buildings being our schools, have an impact on what that may mean for the type of students and the needs of those students in those buildings. Duration of boundaries, ultimately, we're trying to get at having these boundaries last forever. Forever, whatever forever means to you. In the duration of boundaries, it's tied to the capacity. And that's why we have conversation about the 75% of a maximum capacity. We can have 100% in the building, but we're saying the target capacity is 75% so that it allows for different size classes as they move through, that we have the right space for that programming for that particular grade. Physical consideration with physical costs, that is as it sounds. We're not going to be doing something that builds new buildings, brings in portables, or additions to any of the facilities. When we get to the fiscal consideration operational costs, this would be how do we staff these buildings? So what's the certified staff? We don't want to increase what the district has budgeted for that. So again, we have a limitation there. That gets into some of the conversations about some of the decisions that have already been made with Wiley being a 6th grade center. Neighborhoods intact. So when and you'll see this here in a moment, when we looked at your district, we have been able to break the district down to types of developments. So think where you live, a single family development, a townhome, an apartments. We're saying that would be completely taken and assigned to an elementary building completely. It wouldn't be split between 2 elementary buildings. Projected enrollment building utilization. How this factors in is we know we can assign a certain number of students to a building based on how we create these attendance zones. We don't want to have too few of kids, and we don't want to have too many. So finding that target capacity of about 75%. Students impacted by a boundary change. With this criteria, we try to minimize the number of students that are going to be impacted. I'm here to tell you, with your plan of having a dual language in one building, and then what that may mean for what transfers into creation of the attendance zones, we're going to impact quite a few kids on the onset of this concept, whichever concept is approved. Transportation considerations. So when we start to look at this, it would be something like everyone within 1.5 miles of the school building. Maybe you attend that school. When you look at the map, you're going to see there's going to be zones in between buildings where you're going to be within 1.5 miles of both of the buildings. Other things that go into transportation might be having more walkers, more bikers, trying to make the transportation that when you do have to pick kids up, how many of those kids can we minimize the amount of time that they're on that bus? More time being in the school buildings. So those are the 10 criteria that we look at. There was no prioritization from the board or for administration. These are all things that when you look at the 2 concepts, what we're asking from you is to provide us some feedback from your lens. Does this work better, or is this a challenge with one of these criteria? And we want to use the starting point as our current boundaries. And how do we maybe make it better, or how do we make it enhanced, or how do you view it as it's just really horrible? So that's the boundary criteria. So a little bit about the data. One of the things that we clearly saw with your data is really a stable enrollment with some slight increase of about 150 students over the next 5 years. We also talked a little bit about what it meant with capacity at the time that capacity was defined a little bit differently than as we went through this process of hitting the target capacity. But then we also know there's some areas in your district where we might see some new developments. And with those developments, we want to make sure that we're saying, hey, there's some students that are going to be in your system based on where those developments are. So I mentioned how we have looked at your district, a deeper dive than just census data, really looking down to the type of developments and understanding what is that correlation with enrollment, demographics, and development. All of that goes into a statistical forecast model, so regression if you're a math nerd, and ultimately we're trying to look at what the closeness is of some of the trending of what's happening in the neighborhood. For instance, if your neighborhood is on average a 80-year-old subdivision, how is it going through its subdivision life cycle? Meaning that at some point there may have been more kids, now there's fewer kids. What type of demographic is moving in? Are they more predispositioned to have a larger family or a smaller family? So all of the different variables that we're looking at are all to tie into understand what potentially could happen at each of those planning areas. This visual, again, go to the district website. You can look at the full entirety of the reports. This helps you give an understanding of when things are worse or better than what we've projected. We give a likely RSP projection based on all of the data that we've done, conversations with the city and whatnot. We've looked at live birth data. That's an important element in understanding what the future may look like, particularly since we're talking about elementary buildings. In 5 years, how comfortable are we going to be that whatever is set for a boundary, do we have X number of kids? Live birth data is our first starting points. We have other tools that we use with our data to get down to those planning areas beyond what a zip code or a county live birth is. But this starts to give us an understanding as that changes over time. Like for instance with COVID, people were forecasting we'd have more live births. That's not happened, right? So what's occurring with those demographics? We'll look at some of the initial trends with the enrollment by grade to get a sense what's happening in the district. Are we starting to see things that are evident in this cohort change table of students as they go from 4th to 5th or 8th to 9th? We start to see some really incredible things on the movement of students in general that is applied down to those planning areas. Like for instance, when we look from 8th to 9th grade, we pick up a great deal number of students, likely students coming from the private parochial homeschool arena into our system. With the ability of looking at this from this planning area level, we can understand how change is occurring in each of these planning areas. So on this map, the orange represents an increase, the green a decrease. This is changing. We're just looking at this in a 5-year window and saying, okay, this is what's happened over the last 5 years. How does this then, with the statistical modeling, does it start to look as we move to the future? We understand based on the students that we've geocoded, where are those density of students? You're going to see this on the maps that we're providing for you this evening. But the reddest areas are where we have the greatest density of kids. And if you look closely, you can see that a lot of the red blob areas are not where facilities are. This makes our ability to get students to buildings and have this neighborhood connectivity the way most people identify it as, hey, I can walk to my school. What we've been challenging communities with is your neighborhood is probably more identified with your neighborhood and what school they go to. Because in many cases, much of your district, there's not a building near them. And so they already identify that, hey, I'm going to Leo, I'm going to King, or whichever one of the buildings. And you see that with your islands that you currently have. We've looked at the median home values of properties because that helps us again identify what number of kids we have. We've ultimately determined a creation of a growth area of where developments could happen, so that way in our modeling we can again forecast that there's going to be students in some of these areas. All that lent itself to say here's where the forecast is going. Why we're saying over the next 5 years there will be about 150 more students in your district. So let's get into the concepts. 6 minutes can do it. We have to start with our current boundaries, right? So we have to agree on some things that are happening in these concepts. Wiley is not going to be an elementary building. It's programmed to be a 6th grade facility. I can't change that in the concepts. We've also been told that we're going to have a dual language in the building. So that's 2 buildings, right? Yankee Ridge and Thomas Paine. We know what the enrollment would be based on where students would reside and how that forecasts out. So we know right now with Dr. Williams, it would be, if everybody in that attendance area went to that building, we would be over capacity, even factoring in all the changes that are happening with the dual language students in the current buildings that they're at. We show what the K-5 boundary density is, or student density is. So again, the red is where the greatest density is. Look how much is right around Dr. Williams. A lot, right? So that makes it a challenge to try to keep some of the things in play. We've also given you a heat map of where the dual language students are to give you a sense that everything up there on Perkins Road, they're getting on a bus and they're going to the current buildings that they're assigned to. And they still will continue because there's no building up there, right? So that got us into concept 1. So concept 1, Yankee Ridge, is the dual language school. And one of the things that we did, and I want to try to give you some justification in the logic of it, is with the dual language, we held it to what the enrollment is approximately right now. We did that from our experiences. When you go to change the location of where a program is, or you change how that program will actually operate, and it will change when it goes into one building. And we have a lot of reference to that in some of the other districts we've worked with. So we kept it the same, knowing that what we want the board and administration and you as a community to know, that if there's a desire to grow this program as there is, with that program being in a building, do we have the space for the program to grow? And the program to grow in the way that the district has been talking about at the board level, where it's not just those that would be, let's say, Spanish speakers or French speakers, but growing it with more English-speaking persons to be integrated into this dual language setting. So I have to mention that because that's something that I didn't say as well last night or as eloquent. So there's lots of things that are also happening where we wanted to be cognizant of where the students were when Wiley was an elementary building. Because there were promises made to those students that, hey, when this building closes, you're going to go to this other building. And so we need to know where those kids are so that we can uphold what that promise was to them. And that means something different whether the dual language is at Yankee Ridge or Thomas Paine. But again, concept 1, Yankee Ridge, is where that dual language is going to be held. Lots of conversation that happened last night. I imagine there'll be some more questions that we'll try to answer again tonight. But on the maps, when you go out to the maps, you're going to have the current attendance boundaries down on the bottom left. You're going to have the heat map on the bottom right for the K-5 students. The solid color that you see up here represents what's being proposed in that concept. I want you to note, it says draft up here in the title, but there's draft written multiple times on each of these maps. It's done for one reason. It's a draft, meaning the things that we hear from last night to tonight can influence what the concept may look like. What it's not going to change, it's not going to change the dual language. It's not going to change Wiley. So, sorry to be the bearer of bad news to those things if that's what you're hoping happens. That can only occur if the board changes that. We also, on the maps, have identified all these different little islands up here. Didn't show up there. But all the islands you have on your north side, we've identified them in a table on the map. So as you see that letter and with the concept, if the color changes, you know in that concept, it's changing to a different attendance area. It was the best way that we could try to visually show you that on the map with the number of islands that you have in your district. You're going to see what the projections are for that. And again, we factored in with both the French and the Spanish being at the dual language site. In this case, it's Yankee Ridge. You're going to see this capacity. And I want to make a note of this because initially, when you look at the differences between Concept 1 and Concept 2, you may say, well, hey, it looks like there's more in one of the concepts that are over the target capacity. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It would be a bad thing if the target capacity for any of the options was like 95, 97%. If we're at 80, 81%, we still have space for the enrollment to fluctuate as the different number of students that are living in the areas that would be attending those zones move through the system. We also show you the students that are impacted by the boundary change, and I will tell you that I had my team check this. If it wasn't 100 times, it could have been 1,000 times that we had the exact number of students that are impacted as a total aggregate in both of the concepts, but they're different on which building they would be going to school with. So you'll see if you come down the column, the building that they're currently residing in, how would that change in this concept? K through 4 students change next year if this were the concept that was approved. We do K through 4 because 5th grade, they move on, right? They're going to Wiley. K through 4, as 1st through 5th graders, they were physically in the buildings, and so as 1st through 5th graders, they're impacted. Incoming kindergarten students, they're impacted, but they're impacted differently in that they were not in that building being served for K-5 education. We also show in the bottom table what the ethnicity breakdown is, and we show a shading where it either exceeds or is lowered by more than 10% of what it was before. Again, a point to this. It's naturally going to change based on where the dual language is in 2 ways. One, when we move the kids to the dual language, the type of kids that are in the dual language might be more predispositioned for something that would be, let's say, free and reduced lunch or a particular subgroup. And if we move the dual language from the 2 buildings into a different building, that's going to impact the buildings that dual language was in. And so we have all these different moves happening that maybe something that you feel should be different, or that you feel there's not quite as much equity in that. And that's what we're going to hear from you tonight. So that's Concept 1. Concept 2, Thomas Paine is the dual language. Again, the same parameters of all the things that we're trying to work through with trying to establish capacities and where the programs are located. Same situation, solid colors represent the color that the students would go to based on where your address is. Dotted lines, what the current boundary is. You'll see the same thing with the enrollment that's projected. Students impacted by the boundary change. And then, of course, the demographics and the free and reduced lunch. One other note that I want to make about the free and reduced lunch. And I mentioned this last night. I want to make sure everyone understands this. We cannot use free and reduced lunch as our baseline of how we create our boundaries. That is a protected class of students. We're just showing you something that with the current situation, we know what the free and reduced lunch is, but we know that where the free and reduced lunch kids end up attending will have an impact when I look over at administration and they have to staff the building. For instance, if it becomes something that's greater or whatnot, if we were to change one of these free and reduced lunch where, let's say it could get to 15 or 20%, don't think it'd be possible, let's just talk hyperbole here. You get a building that wouldn't be Title I, and how would the funding work through and getting to the students with their needs? We also have a map that you're able to look at and download with the Wiley boundary, so that you can understand how we know how that's associated with some of those students. This last table shows you some things with when we look at where students are residing in the concepts based on the dual language. Who's French speaking, who's Spanish speaking, you get a sense of that current K-5 population. Who are those kids, where are they, and how many students in those areas would have been students that would have gone to Wiley if Wiley was still operating as an elementary building with the boundary that I showed you on the previous page. Here's another page where I put updated, and we updated the last bullet points for concept 1. The cross-categorical special education would remain at Thomas Paine. We see that as a pro because the program is already there. All of the pros and cons, this was our way of looking at this from the data and what we were set out to try to accomplish. We're giving you two drafts that are uniquely different because of the dual language program, which building it is in. I'm hoping we get even more conversation, specifically if you can tie it back to the 10 criteria that I outlined for you of why something might be better or maybe it's not so good. That helps my team as we look through this. I'm a little bit more of an expert today as I drove around your community, but you all know what it's like as you are doing it at pick up and drop off. And what that may mean is we impact and change schools. So again, these are the pros and cons as we outlined them with the RSP best planning practice. Last slide, then we open this up. And I went a little bit long, but I wanted to make sure I went over a few of these things a little bit better than I did last night. We tried to categorize, I believe, in these 6 areas for you to understand how we might say this could be better, or in some cases, it's about the same. So when we look at the dual language, we believe that it's a little bit stronger with concept 1. We also think the projected enrollment is a little bit better in concept 1. And that's why I outlined what target capacity means. The students impacted, we also think it's a slight advantage to concept 1. Again, you can disagree with how we've come to that decision. We're not here to try to convince you of that. The bottom 2 we felt were kind of equally distributed between both concepts, meaning we didn't feel like it was weighted one way so much better than the other. And that was in the neighborhood connectivity, and that was in the student demographics. That kind of makes sense if you think about the neighborhood connectivity. If you're attending a building right now, and you're now moving to another building, you're gonna feel like your connectivity was severed, right? So I don't think we ever would have a pro to one of the concepts in that particular category. So let me tell you about the public input. So Dr. Edward White indicated that we're gonna have 30 minutes where you're able to provide questions and comments. I wanna set the tone just like I did last night. I'm not here as your enemy. I actually look at myself here as I'm your guest. And so my hope is that you would treat me as a guest, and your questions would be in that type of format of inquisitiveness and curiosity, trying to find out something. My team, we did not work towards addressing something that would be for sure in a particular board member's interest or an administrator's interest. We tried to take the parameters that we were given with Wiley being a 6th grade building, the dual language, and then how do we start to align things with those given realities. They're probably not popular with a lot of you that are here tonight, and I understand that, and I want to extend my empathy, and so let's talk this through, let's be civil in what our conversation is over the next 30 minutes. Ultimately, where I'm going to try to steer you with some of your feedback is to the survey. I can't tell you every process once we've shifted to this MetroQuest survey. This has helped us to be able to definitively say that there's things that you know about your community that we just can't know from the data or from our office in Kansas City. We want to glean that from you tonight so that we can see if there's ways in which we can adapt the plans to be more cohesive to what you in the community may want to see. Did you want to say anything more? Oh, that's right. We have the FAQs from last night.
I'm going to try to do these really quickly because I know we're into your 30 minutes. So yesterday, we had several people who came to the mic and asked questions. So to save time, we thought we would display those so we don't answer the same question multiple times tonight. This first question, and I'm gonna turn over here so I can see them. So I think Rob has already answered this. Unfortunately, last night on the map, we forgot to mention the cross-category program, but we have corrected that. So we did want to just mention that during the renovation, there were some intentional instructional spaces, sensory spaces, and playground spaces that were built into that remodel. If DL is at Yankee Ridge, what school will the intensive instruction program be moved to? So we had a parent here and another parent asking about that last night. Currently, the intensive instruction program is housed at Yankee Ridge. They usually use 2 classrooms. There are about 5 students there right now. Once decisions are made around the boundary plan, we will assess the space available and it will be, we'll figure out where that program will go. We'll make sure that we communicate with families and give them an opportunity to visit their new schools at the end of the year. As the maps are drawn, they're choppy. So we had someone mention that, actually a couple people mentioned that. The new maps are substantially more compact than the existing school boundaries. So I think Rob has already talked about that. Concept 1 is substantially more compact than concept 2. Target capacity numbers. And John, a lot of the text is cut off. The number of classrooms will not change and the number of students don't change. The average classroom size will stay about the same. So when we gave the capacity, we used all of our class size language that's in our negotiated contract with our union for our class sizes, and we actually went under those numbers for every grade level by several kids. So that's how we came up with that 75%. Both concepts show Orchard Downs remaining a King school, so I know that is a big question. We've heard it at board meetings, we've heard it in public comments, we heard it last night. Would it be better to move the multicultural program to Leo instead of King, and because those students actually live a little bit closer? So many of you, I think, see that as a negative, that that those students are a little further away. We see it as a significant positive. Having been the principal at King School for years and years, for 8 years, it has a very rich history, very successful program for over 30 years. I didn't go back today and count, but very successful. Many of the teachers at King School have intentionally gone back to school to get their ESL endorsements. They attend a lot of professional development around how to work with students that are learning a new language. From our refugee and immigrant populations, right now, we have specific spaces in King to meet the needs of some larger groups, Pashto, Arabic, Mandarin, which includes about 90 students and 6 teachers, as well as their instructional spaces. So that is a lot of space that's designated to the multicultural program, that we don't know that we would have that space at Leo. The 1.25 miles. So we actually mapped out the distance. So right now, all the Orchard Downs students are given transportation to King. Currently, if we move them to Leo, they would no longer get bus transportation, which we kind of see as a con, because a lot of our students, a lot of the graduate students and people who travel here, many don't have their own vehicles, many are learning a new language, and we feel that that would greatly impact families to have their students that don't know any English and they themselves are learning English, having to walk to school and not receiving transportation any longer. Why is the French dual language program being grouped with the whole language dual language school? So this came up several times last night. So the first bullet, I think, is the most important bullet here. It is what the French Lingala families would like to see happen for their children. So I think that is just clearly said there. The whole dual language school provides a multicultural space across an entire building that supports the 3 pillars of dual language. It would also provide an opportunity for professional development that is specific to the needs of dual language learners across an entire building. The multilingual model creates a considerable appeal to recruiting staff who feel really supported in a truly multilingual, multi-language school. I think we've already talked about this. Rob talked about the board preference for neighborhood proximity over socioeconomic status. So that basically just says moving those students to a combined dual language school changes that number impact greatly. Not a lot, but a little bit. And that was brought up again last night. And if both Spanish and French dual language are together in one school, does it help the students if they're pulled away from the English dominant students? Is there a better way to balance the buildings? So I think the people who ask this question don't really know a lot about the program. Both of our programs already have English dominant students there. So by design, the dual language French and Spanish programs include English dominant students. So I think that was the last major question that we heard multiple times. So now if you have a specific question that wasn't addressed here or that Rob hasn't addressed in his presentation, feel free to come to this side and I will hand you the mic and we can kind of make a line right here. John and I are going to be taking notes so we can make sure that we answer your questions if we don't answer them tonight.
Thank you very much, Jeff Presiani. Here I am. There you go. Nice start. So I'm a parent of kids who attended Yankee Ridge and now UMS. I have a very specific question about one of the tables regarding concept 1. So basically, students impacted in boundary change. So in concept 1 is if Yankee Ridge is selected as the standard DL hub, and the number there is student impacted by boundary change is 0. Can you explain that number to me? Is that referring only to students who already attended the DL program at Yankee Ridge, so they're not affected because they'll continue to be there? Is that correct?
You're referring to concept 1?
Yes.
All right, so if we look at the students impacted by the boundary change, this is based on reside. So there are going to be some kids that made a choice or moved to a different building based on the intra-district transfer policy that the district has. So if we read across with what we're looking at, let's look at like Thomas Paine. So we know 5 kids would go to King, 28 would go to Leal, 54 would go to Dr. Williams, based on where they currently reside with the current boundary. So we look at this bottom left, and then how does it associate up when we move into this particular situation?
I'm sorry, that's not an answer to my question. My question is, this is the concept 1, right? The Yankee Ridge being the DL hub. And the table of the students impacted by boundary change shows that the number for Yankee Ridge is 0. And my question was, is that because this table only reflects the students who are currently in DL so they don't have to move? Or does the table also include the students who are not in DL and have to move because of this change?
So again, if we go across the table, if we look at Yankee Ridge, 62 would go to King, 149 to Leal, 54 to Dr. Williams. The 0 is there because none of those kids remain at Yankee Ridge. They go to a different building, and that's how you get the summation of the 243.
Oh, okay.
And that whole diagonal is 0 because they're not changing if they're going from their school to their school.
Okay, so the actual number is 243.
Correct, that are moving to a different building.
Okay, thank you. That was
You bet, good question. Next one.
Thank you. I have a more general question about this whole process. So I know that a lot of us are very unhappy with the fact that there's only 2 maps. I know that that's what you've been asked to do, so how much would it cost and how long would it take you to produce additional maps? For example, a lot of the taxpayers in town are very unhappy about $25 million being spent on a 6th grade center, when your numbers show very clearly that UMS is not actually overcrowded. So in order for us to sort of accept these proposals, it would be really helpful to know how it would look like if Wiley, for example, was used as a Yale school and not as a sixth grade center. Even if that's perhaps impossible to do or not.
So I'll start an answer at that. So in order for there to be a change where we make Wiley a elementary building, or we change the idea that the dual language would stay in 2 buildings, that would take something where the board would have to say we're changing what some of those initiatives are. At this point, we'd have to have that conversation with the board. Would they want to do that? That would set things in motion of, all right, so if that's now the premise, how do we then draw some boundaries, align them so that we have something that aligns to what you're
How long would
requesting?
that take, or how much would that cost? Would citizens be able to obtain a map like that, given, if we wanted to pay for it ourselves, how much would that cost?
I think those are all questions that go to administration on how
Okay.
they deal with that.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna address that until the board actually gives us a directive to
Sure.
address that. So I did wanna comment on the narrative around UMS being overcrowded. I've been there every morning for 3 weeks. If you would like to come and walk around UMS, I will be there to give you a tour, so you can see how we are utilizing the spaces for 920 students. If you saw the enrollment analysis, you saw that the only growth that will be happening in any of our areas will be at UMS in the next 5 years. So again, I'm there every morning. So if you would like a tour, please contact me, and I'm happy to walk you through the hallways, and you could even sit in some classrooms if you like.
All right, next person.
I hope you don't mind if I ask 2 very closely related questions. They're more about procedure and kind of the standard process for redistricting, so hopefully from your perspective you can kind of help me with this. So I'm not a big fan of hypotheticals, but as a consulting company you probably have this fairly well sketched out. If a district were to approach you and has redistricting several years on the horizon, and they wanted your opinion for the best timeline to do the analysis, modeling, sharing of maps, public feedback, and all the decision making, what would you recommend to them as the ideal timeline? Like when to start, when to do all of those different steps?
That's your first one.
That is my first one.
It would be never, don't realign your boundaries, right? The reality is, it's getting the process approved in the timeline that the district can appropriately do whatever staffing changes are necessary for the year that the boundary would take place. And so that falls in line with this April timeline for Urbana School District.
This is not my second question, but what's the normal for you in terms of when you start engaging and start doing this process, make the proposal, have the approvals done and all of that? Is it pretty in line with what you're doing here?
Oh, it's all over the place. We have so many processes. Timeline, we have some that are gonna go through into the summer and into the fall of this year. It really depends on how the data is driving the need to make some changes. We have some districts where they have financial cliffs, and we must make some decisions for them right now. So I would say the ideal process is however it fits into what the district is trying to achieve with the metrics of capacity, enrollments, and whatnot. So nothing that says you started in October and you must, it's really that staffing piece that I was telling you.
Thank you. So the second one is, based off of all of the experience where you've been doing this sort of process of drawing maps, how frequently does a district ask you to make multiple models that would take into account the closing of one school or the repurposing of one school and or the closing or repurposing of another school? Like how often does that happen compared to the number of times you're just redrawing maps?
Gosh, good questions. Unfortunately, it's a lot more with closing the buildings because what we're seeing is there's enrollment decline in a lot of the districts we're working with. And so we try to adapt the process to fit what that means. In some cases, in this instance, we're not closing the building because Wiley's already closed. But if there is a closure of a building, there are some parameters that we want to be done, and some of it is communication to the public. If they don't know when the school's closing, they need to know, right? So in this process, we're just realigning the boundaries and moving programs to some different buildings.
Right, but is it common for you to have a district say, we need to close or repurpose a school? Can you draw maps for us to help us know which school to close or repurpose? Does that happen?
Oh, for sure. I know some people from last night mentioned the work that we've done in St. Charles 303.
Yep.
So that's a great example where we started out with an understanding that a building was closing, and another building was going to be repurposed for early childhood. We were creating another building where we would have dual language, kind of like what we're doing here. So it's all over the place. I can't say that there's one definitive. I do know that we are working with more projects that when it becomes something where we're coming into it and the school has not already been closed, that we're moving those into more of a facility master plan concept, because it requires other things that we would need to look at, from the condition of the buildings to what's staffed in those buildings, how it's going to influence the breakup of certain parts of the community.
If I were to request that information, like what percentage you do that do one way or another, would you be able to share it?
It would be something if we worked through the board, we'd have to dig through to look at, what have we historically done with that.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. All right, next person. All right, it's gonna be a good one. It's a kid.
Okay, so you said that 0 people would remain at Yankee Ridge if it did get turned into a full dual language school, but you also said that French would remain there.
All right, so when we look at, when I want to go back with our data, just so I can say something, I'm going to hold your question, and I'm going to go back so I can look at the data so I can be definitive in a response that'll go to the superintendent. What I want to make sure is that when we say, like with the French dual language kids staying there, how did we calibrate that in the connection of where you reside and how you attend? Because we know a lot of the kids that are in some of these programs are not physically in the current attendance boundary. So let me dig into that a little more into, are you going to answer?
Yeah, so I'll just to clarify on this, so the zeros you see where it says Yankee Ridge under Yankee Ridge and next to Yankee Ridge, that's 0 kids who are moving from Yankee Ridge to Yankee Ridge, right? So that's not kids who are getting moved. That's a 0 because that's showing where kids are coming from and where they're going to. And so those are all, that diagonal is always going to be 0, right?
Yeah, so you're seeing the diagonal, and then we also look at the column. So, right, so if we go Yankee Ridge to Yankee Ridge, there's no Yankee Ridge going to Yankee Ridge. If you're at Yankee Ridge, let me explain this another way. So if you live in Yankee Ridge right now, and let's say you're in the French program, and you live in Yankee Ridge, you're still in Yankee Ridge because of the French program. So you're not impacted by the boundary change because the French program's at Yankee Ridge. So, but I still want to go back and I want to look at some of the data to make sure as we move the students around with either the Spanish or French affiliation, that I can definitively tell you that those kids are in that number or they're not in that number. That's a good question that I had even from last night. Great, thank you. Next person.
My question is more about capacity and whatever becomes dual language, because I'm assuming like if it gets moved, you're going to lose some students in the program, because that's what's been done traditionally. Like it happened, I think, with the French, where some remained at Kingman and one go to Yankee Ridge. So did your numbers, I guess, has a survey been done to know how many would drop out of the program because they don't want to move schools? So like say like a mom might go at Leo, wants to stay at Leo instead of moving. Was that considered or not? I don't know.
Good question. I'll take a stab and then I'll pass it off. So here's one of the things. I'm pretty sure from the experiences we've had in other districts, if the program's going to move to another building and you took a survey, the majority of the people that would respond to the survey, if you're in walking distance of that program, you like that program because you can just walk to that building. If it's going to no longer be walkable, you're probably going to say, I'm going to drop out of the program. So that being said, one of the things that we recommend when we get to the point where you're starting to look at what the impact is of a program that's being moved, is to do a survey of what that means. But don't do the survey until we get to the point of where we've solidified more, probably in the next couple of weeks, to say, hey, we're leaning towards what we see in whatever concept 1 and 2 kind of move on to. What are your thoughts if the program moves? Does that answer them all? All right, good.
Hi, so my question is, what are the metrics used from the public input forums to influence the decision of the board? And is this defined?
Right, so metrics. Well, I do know this. Wiley is a 6th grade center changing to a K-5 or changing all the elementaries to K-6s. That has to come from the board. The other thing that has to change in order whether the public says what their thoughts are would be the dual language. If we're moving to one school with the dual language, in order for that to change, it has to come from the board.
I've got one follow-up question. The time from input from the community to what sounds like the action, if I understand the agenda or timeline correctly, seems really short. And that makes me feel like this is more of a formality than it is a chance to change the decision of the board.
And that's fair. What's interesting is always your lens you look from. My team, we're looking at basically March 1st to April 2nd, I think is the first read.
Yeah, and the survey is open until March 8th.
And then the survey's open through March 8th. We're looking at that, wow, that's a long time for the public feedback and time for the board to look at it. But as far as foregone conclusion, it's unless the board were to change some of these things that I've heard last night and I'm hearing tonight, what we see here, there's going to be some undulation from that. Because I think there's some things that were pointed out last night that may make one concept or another concept a little bit stronger with some of the values that you guys have here in the community. You bet.
So I want to add a comment about the timing. So I know this space, we have a lot of parents, but we've met with a lot of our staff who could possibly be impacted by one concept or the other. So April 16th is really late for a teacher or a ESP support person or even a principal. So they are very anxious we went and met with all of the schools and they want to know, can we shorten this time period and make a decision in March and not have to wait until April? So I think, what people are looking for is a little different. I know our staff members feel like April is really late for them. And so I do think we kind of have to have that in-between window. So I just wanted to point that out as well. Is it March? I thought it was March 8th. March 15th? Sorry.
And March 15th is when we meet again with the admin team to explore what we've heard from different things. And then April 2nd is where the first read occurs. Next question, comment.
Yeah, I have a number of questions about the data analysis. I'll get them to you, I guess, in the next session for the most part. But since the slide 13 said the forecast of the population projections was the main focus, the central focus of everything you do. When you get to the projections, they're what in statistical jargon we call point estimates, exact numbers, and then you report them as in capacity with a tenth of a decimal place, so 80.4%. But the whole point about forecasting is you've got a slew of variables here, is that you get an interval, range, right? So you said they're regression models. What you get on a standard regression model or a time series model is a big interval. And then the thing we need to know to understand the comparisons is what's the interval. And if the intervals overlap, it doesn't matter if one of them is, your point estimate is 280 and the other is 279. They're not different. So I'm confused that you initially said these regressions are the focus of everything you do, and then you give us a lot of comparisons with point estimates, and reporting them as percentages with that decimal place particularly seems like a silly practice. As you know, 5 years out, there's enormous uncertainty, and even beyond the variables you list, there's the uncertainty of whether people are going to peel off the private school because they're so unhappy with the public schools.
Maybe they'll be drawn in because the public schools are performing so excellently. But either way, it seems like you're actually not taking the uncertainty very seriously, even though you said it was the central focus.
And that's your opinion. Next question.
No. Where's the interview? Okay, so
Again, I'm not going to go into, for instance, for the statistical model. We can talk offline and we'll get into whatever, but I want to get to the questions of how people are
I want other
perceiving
people to ask questions too. I just
concepts
didn't.
next person. Please.
Okay.
I think it's fair to answer this question.
And again, you have to
The process, so we're curious about the way you came to your conclusions. We're just asking for you to expand on what your rationale is. It's not being rude. We're asking you to tell us what's happening.
And as okay, we're going to move into the slides. We'll go through this. So I'm going to show you on this slide how this works. So when we're looking at how our analysis comes to a point where we're giving you a number, there clearly can be a range, because when we get into a 98 or 95% confidence interval range, you can have a range. Again, it's a projection. I want to give you kind of a visuals for those of you who don't regularly get into statistical analysis. The farther you go out in time, whatever variables you make as your assessment of what's going to happen, in this case with population change, there's more error. And so what we've done with our RSP likely projection, and so this is something that's unique to what RSP does and how we historically have a 95 to 100% accuracy with our RSP likely projection. Caveat being COVID did not forecast a pandemic. But when you look at all of the variables and how they are applied to each of the planning areas, so when I showed you the map of the specific areas, whether it's an apartment complex, a single family development, there's all these different variables that are factored into what I would call an attractiveness of how do we end up seeing a certain number of students at any particular grade. So when you think of the 13 years that we have of kindergarten through 12th grade, when you look at where you live and you know neighbors that have moved out of your subdivision, and let's say they had a 3rd and 5th grader, what we're trying to do with all the metrics that we look at, when that family moves out, who's going to move in? Will they have another 3rd and 5th grader, or will it be 8th or 12th graders? And so with the analysis that we do statistically, we're able to quantify what that may mean for a particular area. In some cases, there's things that are anomalies. For instance, we've had instances with Catholic Charities when they bring in different immigrants to certain areas that was not something that we saw. Or, for instance, in these growth areas that we've spoke to you about. Let me go to this. Sometimes the building doesn't trend the way we thought it would based on the information that we collected. So all of these variables that I just kind of glossed over from a statistical perspective, it's coming back to this general formula that gets at how over a series of time do we see change in any of these planning areas. That's the general, without getting into things where we bring our stat analyst in to talk on a math level, but I want to keep it where you know all of these variables are looked at. We have a track record of being accurate, and that's why when we get into these conversations of what could the attendance zones look like, we're able to say definitively, this is where it's headed. Again, I would say with a 95% certainty that this is where it goes. Again, another caveat, when we get into some of the dual language or categorical programs, as those change over time, that can influence the number of kids that we see in any of these zones. Next question.
Last one, because we want to make sure we get
important as others. I have a student that's going to be going into kindergarten, so I'm going to be new to the district and in the district for the next 19 years. After her, we have another one. So you were saying that these drafts, based on input, could change. Is that what I'm understanding? They could undulate based on public input. So these two concepts may change from here. Then they're going to be presented to the board. Is that correct understanding?
I'll address the change. Yes, I think there's some things that can be evolved in these concepts with the parameters that we have set out with the dual language, whether it's at Yankee Ridge or Thomas Paine, K-5 enrollments, where categorical is. There's going to likely be some changes. I think there's some good things that have been mentioned, but we're waiting for all the comment from last night, tonight, and from the public survey.
So we want to at least leave the last 20 minutes for people who aren't comfortable coming up and speaking in a room of this size on a microphone. So if you have a very specific comment for Rob, if you want to kind of stay over here, if your comments were for him, or questions rather. If you have questions for John and I, you can come over here. Our administrators are going to kind of go to maps, and if you have specific things you want us to note in our notes that you want a follow-up question, just please let us know. So we definitely don't want people who are supposed to be at the orchestra concert to miss that. So we're going to leave the last 19 minutes to kind of get up and walk around and talk about the maps. So thank you all again for coming.
Dr. J. Stop on me. But I'll ask you a question. Yeah. So you can, I want you to